This footage shows one of the many Ukrainian attacks on Russia's energy infrastructure. These attacks are reaching farther and farther into Russian territory. Most recently, the Ukrainians struck the refinery in Omsk, a city that is closer to Mongolia than to Kyiv. And Russia is running increasingly short of fuel. The internet has been flooded with videos like this one, showing Russians fighting over fuel. And the Russian government is helpless. In this video, we'll explain what's happening in Russia and what the consequences of the current situation might be. Recently, we talked about the situation in Crimea, where ordinary residents are still unable to buy fuel. A state of emergency has been introduced on the peninsula. Since our previous video, very little has changed there, and the crisis continues. However, fuel shortages are now being experienced by Russians in almost every corner of the country.
Biorąc pod uwagę całość,
Looking at the Russian Federation as a whole, some form of fuel cells restriction now exists in as many as 80 regions. In more than 40, roughly 50 of those regions, these are administrative restrictions. Local authorities have concluded that some form of rationing is necessary, for example, by banning the filling of jerry cans to prevent stockpiling or introducing limits on how many liters of diesel or gasoline can be sold per vehicle. So these are, in effect, fuel rationing measures. In many places, there simply isn't any gasoline available at all. And today, my husband stood in line at a gas station for 6 hours and he couldn't get any fuel. Everyone was waiting. Then a fuel truck arrived, unloaded the gasoline and left. Everyone was happy, thinking, now we're going to fill up. 6 hours. Not a single car got refueled. Technical difficulties. Nobody knows what that means. And that leads to fights over fuel. There are many accounts like this circulating online. Tensions are rising. This is what queuing for petrol looks like these days. Please, let's treat each other with respect. We're all equal, and we all need gasoline. Everyone wants to fill up. And then a fight broke out. Oh God, this is how we have to live these days. Fighting over gasoline. This is the result of highly effective Ukrainian attacks.
Od początku tego roku
Since the beginning of this year, Ukraine has been steadily increasing the intensity of its attacks on Russian energy infrastructure. Since March, we have effectively been witnessing an escalation, which reached its highest point in May and June. During that period, nearly every major Russian refinery was attacked, with the exception of one located in the Far East. Then in July, Ukraine struck Russia's largest refinery in terms of processing capability, the one located in Omsk, in Siberia. The attack on Omsk came as a huge surprise to everyone. It's nearly 3,000 kilometers from Kyiv.
co stanowi niezaprzeczalny dowód na to, że
This is undeniable proof that Ukrainian attacks have not only become more frequent and more effective, they have also expanded dramatically in range. The strike on Omsk came as a major shock to Russians because it had been assumed that refineries located beyond the Ural Mountains were safe. It turned out they were not. It shows that no refinery in Russia can be considered safe. What's more, some facilities have been struck multiple times.
to te rafinerie, które sukcesywnie atakuje się
Refineries that are repeatedly targeted over a period of time often suspend production entirely. This applies, for example, to the Moscow refinery in Kapotnia. It also applies to the refinery in Tuapse, on the Black Sea coast, as well as the Kirishi refinery near St. Petersburg, which had largely been created as an export-oriented refinery. Ukrainian drone attacks have become part of everyday life in Russia.
Saturacja przestrzeni powietrznej jest na tyle
The
duża.
saturation of Russian airspace is now so great that some drones inevitably get through and strike their targets. These attacks affect not only refineries, but also oil depots, logistics infrastructure, and other facilities, disturbing the functioning of Russia's fuel market. It appears that Ukraine has no intention of slowing the pace of these attacks, and Russia is unable to stop them. Ukrainian attacks are reducing Russia's refining capacity. It had already fallen by as much as 1/3. This is happening during the summer, when fuel demand is at its highest. As a result, prices are rising rapidly, even though they are regulated by the government, which subsidizes the refineries. In theory, fuel prices should not increase faster than inflation, but that's only the theory.
I pomimo tego subsydiowania
Despite these subsidies, retail gasoline and diesel prices, those monitored by the Kremlin and state regulators, have increased. According to official data from the Federal State Statistics Service, Росстат, they have risen by 14% since the beginning of the year, while overall inflation stands at about 5%. In May, it was approximately 5.3%. Moreover, even that inflation figure and the official fuel price statistics do not fully reflect reality. Росстат uses only a sample of gas stations, and its methodology primarily includes stations operated by the major oil companies, where prices tend to be lower. If we instead look at figures published by independent Russian agencies, fuel prices increased by around 20% during just the first 10 days of July, while according to Россtat's methodology, the increase was reported as only about 2–3%. All of this is fueling frustration among ordinary Russians. 380 rubles a liter. A liter of petrol costs more than a liter of milk, more than a liter of vodka. It might be cheaper to run the car on methylated spirits. This is madness. No, seriously, 380 rubles. 380 rubles, right. Let's get on with it. Rising fuel prices are also having a major impact on other sectors of the economy. These are statements from Russian farmers. People are talking a lot about grain in social media right now because they can't harvest the crops, and they say bread will be expensive in stores. Guys, there won't be any dairy if there's no food for the cows. There won't be any meat if there's no food for the cows, pigs, poultry, and so on. Do you even realize what's going to happen if there's no proper harvest this year? I honestly can't imagine. What on earth are we going to do? I have no idea. If crop farmers have to buy diesel at these prices, they'll have to charge more for their grain. But I know I won't be able to sell my meat and dairy products at higher prices because people simply don't have the money. So what choice do I have? I reduce my herd and keep only enough for myself. The grain farmer faces the same problem. I used to buy 15 to 18 tons of grain from him. Now I might buy only 5. Then he starts wondering, why should I go into debt to buy expensive diesel if I won't be able to sell my grain afterward? I'll just be left with debt. That's the chain reaction we're facing. And in my opinion, the Ministry of Agriculture is focused on all the wrong things. This isn't support for farmers. It's a noose around their necks. And what do the Russian authorities have to say about this?
Tak naprawdę do czerwca władze...
Up until June, the Russian authorities downplayed both the threat and the scale of these attacks. Their standard explanation was that fuel market problems were the result of unscheduled maintenance work at refineries. They avoided openly discussing the source of the attacks. While there were occasional hits, the official position never acknowledged that Ukrainian attacks were successfully hitting refinery infrastructure and reducing fuel production. However, by June, the scale of the crisis had become so great that it effectively forced the Russian authorities, including Vladimir Putin, to finally admit the problem. They acknowledged that Ukrainian drones were successfully striking so many refineries that fuel shortages had become unavoidable. Deputy Prime Minister Alexander Novak, who oversees Russia's energy sector, even admitted that these attacks were the primary cause of the problems Russians are now experiencing. Naturally, the current situation at petrol stations is causing concern among the public. To resolve the existing problems and stabilize the situation, the government continues to take further measures.
No ale oczywiście rosyjskie władze
Naturally, the Russian authorities continue trying to reassure the public. They argue that the resilience of Russia's energy sector is strong enough to withstand the crisis, and that the situation is difficult but manageable, and that there is light at the end of the tunnel. They insist that sooner or later, thanks to the policy tools at their disposal, they will stabilize the situation and everything will return to normal. But that's a real question. Will everything truly return to normal? There is, however, another narrative emerging among Russian politicians and in state propaganda.
Oni często wypowiadają się w
They often argue that these hardships simply have to be endured. According to this narrative, Russia is facing a threat created by NATO's support for Ukraine, and people should not complain about fuel shortages that prevent them from driving to the store when Russian soldiers are supposedly fighting a life-or-death struggle against the West in Ukraine. The public is told that they simply have to get used to it. The assumption is that Russians can endure a great deal, and therefore they should also accept the fact that fuel prices sometimes exceed those in the European Union. There's no gasoline. I still remember in my generation. I remember when food was rationed. In my hometown of Krasnodar, back in 1992, we had ration coupons. We'd cut them out and take them to the shops. And I personally, when I was 11 or 12, I used to go around with buckets to fetch water. Not Coca-Cola. Not for anything luxurious, just for water. Because there simply wasn't any water. And water tankers would come a few blocks away. You had to go with jugs and buckets. That was right in the center of Krasnodar, not out in the countryside with a carrying pole on your shoulders. It really happened. We all remember it. We're not making any of this up. Did we survive? We survived. And we'll survive this time too. I have no doubt about it. They're doing all this so that, just like in 1917, we'll rush out onto the streets, overthrow Father Tsar, and then cause so much chaos that even the British themselves were frightened by it. I don't think we're living in those sorts of times now. That's why I'm appealing to everyone. Keep calm, keep calm. Yes, it's tough. Yes, it's very tough, but keep calm. And for now, stop the parties. This isn't the time for that. So what exactly has the Russian government done in response? First, Russia lowered environmental fuel standards in an effort to increase supply. Second, it introduced new regulatory measures designed to improve the functioning of the fuel market. Third, it implemented the rationing measures we mentioned earlier. And fourth, perhaps most notably, Russia significantly increased fuel imports from Belarus and even from countries such as India.
Natomiast tak czy siak, biorąc pod uwagę...
Even so, considering Belarus's refining capacity and the volume it can actually export to Russia, the country's two operating refineries can only cover the equivalent of about 3 to 4 days of Russia's average gasoline demand during the summer season. Russia has also turned to India. But we should remember that shipments from India require roughly 3 to 4 weeks to arrive, and then have to be unloaded and distributed throughout the country. They are also expensive. Russia has to purchase this fuel at normal global market prices. And there is no guarantee that Ukraine will not try to disrupt these imports as well, for example, by striking Russian port infrastructure, something it has already done. So it remains uncertain to what extent Russia will actually be able to close this supply gap through imports. All of these Russian measures are simply proving ineffective and insufficient.
Na tę chwilę wydaje się, że rząd rosyjski jest bezsilny.
At this point, the Russian government appears to be helpless. It can certainly try to patch the holes through imports, regulatory measures, or even appeals for consumers to reduce fuel consumption. But the underlying structural reason for the shortage is the war against Ukraine. Ukraine has found a way to inflict significant economic damage and create real discomfort inside Russia. The issue is not only that fuel is unavailable because production has fallen or because infrastructure is being destroyed. The Russian federal budget must also compensate energy companies for fuel imports and subsidize fuel sales so that prices remain low enough for Russian consumers. The only lasting and realistic solution to Russia's fuel problems, therefore, would be to stop the Ukrainian attacks. That raises questions about Russia's future strategy. The Kremlin's problems extend far beyond fuel. Its progress on the battlefield has been far from satisfactory, and negotiations with the United States are also not playing out as Moscow had hoped. As a result, more and more people are asking whether Putin might choose the path of escalation.
Kreml ma teraz dylemat ewidentny.
The Kremlin is clearly facing a dilemma. On the one hand, there are factors that argue against escalation, or at least in favor of postponing it. One of those factors is the so-called election in Russia this autumn. For the Kremlin, this is an important political operation that it wants to carry out under conditions that are as politically stable and predictable as possible. A major escalation could create additional risks. The greatest risk is that the Kremlin could once again achieve exactly the opposite of what it intends. By acting more aggressively, it could end up further mobilizing the other side, even strengthening its unity and resistance, and increasing pressure on Russia itself. It's also worth noting that the Kremlin may view certain medium-term developments with some optimism.
Na przykład to jest zima.
One example is winter. Russia hopes that its devastating attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure will eventually mean that another winter brings a humanitarian crisis to Ukraine. The expectation is that this would raise the political cost of continuing the war so much that Kyiv would begin seeking to freeze the conflict through concessions to Moscow. That is clearly one of the scenarios on which Moscow appears to be placing some hope. Another factor is the political situation in Europe. From Moscow's perspective, growing social dissatisfaction and domestic political problems across European countries work in Russia's favor. There's also a series of important elections in Europe: the elections in France, in the United Kingdom, and later the elections in Germany. In the Kremlin's view, these political developments could significantly reshape European policy in a way that benefits Moscow. On the other side of the equation, however, are the very problems we discussed in this video.
I w tej sytuacji wręcz pojawia się presja ze strony...
In this situation, pressure is even beginning to emerge from parts of the Russian elite to take some kind of decisive action. Certain public attitudes and some sociological studies suggest that there is growing demand for a turning point, for some bold and dramatic move that would fundamentally change the situation. This is also reflected in the statement of leading pro-Kremlin foreign policy commentators, such as Sergei Karaganov and Dmitry Trenin, who argue that Russia must restore fear in Europe. They go so far as to advocate the potential use of nuclear weapons in Ukraine, and even, potentially, military strikes against targets in Europe. In this view, such actions would weaken Western alliances and fundamentally alter the strategic situation, forcing the West to make major concessions to Russia. So far, however, there still appears to be resistance within the Kremlin, and a certain degree of caution against going that far. Nevertheless, there are increasing signs that the Kremlin is preparing Russian society for escalation through its propaganda, particularly anti-Western messaging and propaganda directed specifically against Russia's neighboring countries. In effect, it is preparing the public for more aggressive actions. At the very least, this could mean an increase in activities that Russia has already been conducting, such as cyber attacks, acts of sabotage, armed provocations, violations of foreign airspace, and drone attacks. All of these scenarios are entirely plausible. The real question is whether Russia will dare to escalate qualitatively. That is, whether it would openly carry out missile strikes against targets on the territory of NATO member states. It seems likely that Russia would only consider this step if it concluded that the crisis affecting the West, internal political conflicts with NATO countries, disagreements between allies, and transatlantic tensions, had reached a point where such an escalation would be relatively safe. In other words, Moscow would have to believe that escalation would produce the outcome it desires, rather than triggering a unified Western response and even greater cohesion among its adversaries. Thank you for watching. If you like this video, take a look at our other stories about Russia on screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.